Okay, yeah, thank you, and I enjoy doing this. It has become an annual celebration of humanism, of friendship, and you know, I'm always honored to be able to honor Darwin. Connecting what Arthur was saying about how long you've been doing this, as I was sitting there, I was thinking that I have a milestone also. This is now 15 years that I've been doing this. Yeah, yeah. So you've been doing this at least 15 years. So I was going over my CV and I was looking. It's like, I was going over my CV, so I didn't repeat a talk I've given recently. And I was looking, and it was 2010 was the first time, and I think I've made it almost every year. So that's my milestone. Okay, so yes, the title of my talk, Homo Sapiens, the Wise Human, but the subtitle is, What Has Happened to Us? And Can Darwin Help Us Understand? So let me start with that. So 30% of all Americans still believe that the 2020 election was stolen. 25% of Americans believe that the January 6th attack on the Capitol was orchestrated by the FBI. Right? Donald Trump is on his way to being the Republican candidate for president. Okay. On October 8th, some people celebrated the atrocities committed by Hamas on October 7th. On October 9th, Israel cut off water, food, electricity, and fuel to 2 million Palestinian men, women, and children. The list of examples of stunning irrationality and moral indecency seems to grow on a daily basis. Yet our species is designated as the wise ones, and we're defined as super cooperators. How can all of this be reconciled? So I want to suggest a Darwinian perspective on the human mind and on our moral psychology and offer some insight. So let's start, in the spirit of Darwin by putting humans in an evolutionary context. So Homo sapiens, as all species, as all animals, our evolution has been guided by imperatives to survive and to reproduce. When we think about what makes our species special, we tend to think about our intelligence, made possible by our big brains. And we do have very big brains, comparatively. Not as much, we're not unique or the top in terms of the volume of brain size or in the number of neurons. But in terms of the size and complexity of our cerebral cortex, we have the largest cerebral cortex of any species. And the cerebral cortex is the part of the brain that's most involved in things we tend to see as higher functions, our planning, our deliberating, reasoning, mathematics, and it really is an impressive organ. All the amazing things, when we think of the amazing things humans, right, who started out as any other creature, struggling to survive in a more dangerous and primitive world, now the things that we can do, write poetry and do philosophy and literature. We can travel to the planets. We can map the galaxies. These are amazing things for an animal to be able to do. But as amazing as that is, it's important to also keep in mind that the brain has not evolved to discover the truths of the universe. That's sort of an extra bonus that we're able to do that. The function of the brain is to guide us toward effective action in surviving, reproducing, and all the things that go into that. This is where, again, I always like to bring in one of my intellectual heroes, John Dewey. It's pragmatism. The point of thinking, the point of our brain is to allow us to act more effectively. So it's interesting to ask, what is it that drove the expansion of the cerebral cortex? Why do we have such a large brain? And this is an important question, because what's very interesting is about the brain is it is a greedy organ. Right? For humans, about 2% of our body mass is the brain, but it consumes 20 to 25% of all our resources. Right? So all the energy, all the calories we take in, almost a quarter goes to feeding the brain. It's a very, very expensive organ. And so any expansion of the brain comes in trade-offs, and there's some interesting trade-offs, and I'd be happy to chat about that. But what I want to focus on are the theories about why that happened. And there are several, but one of the more prominent and the one I want to discuss is known as the social brain hypothesis. And it seems that one of the major factors driving the evolution of the brain, the expansion of the brain, is our ability to and our need to live in social groups. There's a connection in nature between social animals, social mammals, and brain size. There's a correlation between the size of a group and the size of the brain. And so the idea is learning how to live in a social group is complicated. And the more complicated the group, the bigger the brain you need. Humans live in, this may be an unfamiliar idea, really the defining thing about humans, what makes us different from any other species, is the size and the complexity of the groups we live in. Just think of how complex this group is, that we brought together by a commitment to humanist principles and today an interest in Darwin. But just think of the different walks of life you have, the different relationships you have with all the other groups you belong to, and how differently you have to be able to interact with all those groups, and how you have to interact with groups you've never met before or people you've never met before. The ability to keep track of all those relationships and be able to smoothly transition from one relationship to the next takes a lot of brain energy. So that is the idea of explaining that connection throughout nature between the size of groups and the size of the brain. So it's, again, what's cause and effect, it is a transaction between the two. The larger the size, the more we needed, the bigger the brain we needed. Those who developed a bigger brain were able to socialize better. But it's socialization, social cooperation, and action that has driven the expansion of the human brain and enabled humans to become the dominant, large species on the planet. So it is, right, our ability to live in groups, to cooperate in groups, to coordinate action with other people is our adaptation, right? We're not particularly large, we're not particularly strong, we're not particularly fierce compared to other animals, but it's our ability to coordinate with other humans in planning actions that is, our key adaptation in our survival. So the group then, all right, and social action becomes our greatest asset in the struggle to survive. I put a timer on so I kept track of how long I'm talking. Don't worry, all right. Because I do have a tendency to go on. So I'm trying to keep myself, okay. So, but there is a downside, right? There are costs to this. Now, and this may not be obvious right away, but this part is obvious, right? An important aspect of being able to cooperate is to be able to think temporally. Right? So when we're coordinating actions, whether it's coming here today, whether it's hunting a predator, whether it's protecting ourselves, protecting ourselves from a predator, hunting a prey, we have to be able to remember the past, right? What's worked in the past. Also, what was my job, right? What is it I'm supposed to be doing in this action? But we also have to be able to imagine the future, right? How, if all of us do X, Y, and Z at a certain time, this will happen. So it allows us to plan, so that ability to imagine the future. So this ability to remember the past and imagine the future is what allows us to plan and to survive and deal with all the challenges we face. It allows us to avoid death, but it also allows us to imagine death, right? To think about death, to experience death and all that's associated with that on a psychological level. So what's the biological response to death, right? And the biological response to death for all species is to fight desperately to survive, right? We have that image of the idea of a cornered animal being dangerous, right? An animal that's cornered and is facing a mortality threat will do anything to survive, and that's a biological response. We can see it in insects, fish, humans, and all living creatures have that instinct in the face of a mortal threat to do whatever possible to survive, right? And humans have that too. So it's been pointed out that on a psychological level, on an emotional level, the response to the threat of death is terror. Right? And this is given rise to, or is incorporated into a theory called terror management theory, TMT. And I might have mentioned this at a talk at some point. So this is a theory developed by three social psychologists, Jeff Greenberg, Tom Pisaczynski, and Sheldon Solomon. It's based on the work of Ernest Becker. Are you familiar with Ernest Becker's famous book, The Denial of Death? They were very impressed with Becker's book, and Becker is arguing that so much of what humans do, in one way or another, is an attempt to deny death, right? To try to find ways to imagine ourselves or have this sense of immortality. And they thought that was very interesting, but how do you test it? And their contributions, they came up with some very, very clever, ingenious ways to show, what happens when we're faced with the threat of death, right? And and they were able to measure this over numerous studies. This caught on. There have been literally hundreds of experiments on this theory showing a very robust response. Right? And the response to death, particularly for humans, is to cling to our group, right? To become more protective of our group, to become more attached to our group, prouder of our group, more willing to work, sacrifice, and defend our group, and right, less sympathetic, more antagonistic, less empathetic to those we perceive as the outgroup, particularly those we perceive as posing a threat to our group. And this makes good evolutionary sense, right? In evolutionary history, the group was in fact our survival mechanism. When we were being threatened by a predator or an enemy, right? It was the group that came to our rescue. It was the group that enabled us to survive. When we were without food, it's the group that would support us through our tough times. We evolved as social species. So for millions of years, and this goes back, right? We're descended from social species going back tens of millions of years. It's baked into our nature, right? The group is our survival strategy, right? So our psychology is very much connected to our being members of a group. All right, so again, this is a terror management theory. So when threatened, we cling to the group. That can be the actual group, that can be physically clinging to the group, physically defending the group, or symbolically, right? Because death for humans is not just an actual threat, it's a symbolic threat, right? And this is, a function of our wonderful brains, or our ability to imagine, is that we can experience the terror of death even when we're safely at home in our beds, right? Where there's no actual threat. Right? We've all had this, right? These dark thoughts that can creep into our minds in the quiet of the night. And we can experience that terror even though we're safe at that moment, right? That's a wonderful uniqueness of humans. It doesn't seem like any other species face death, but it doesn't seem, and other species respond to the death of loved ones, of group members, but we don't have any evidence that other animals fixate on death, right? Get anxious about their death, right? Or have their lives shaped by, the fear of death and trying to struggle to find ways to avoid aging and et cetera. That seems to be one of our unique characteristics and gifts of our big brains. So it can be an actual threat or a symbolic threat, an actual group or a symbolic group. So, and if we can look at history, and we can look at recent history and to see this at work. So just think back to 9/11, right? And the American response after 9/11. One response was to unify, right? To come together, right? We were under attack, right? That was an attack on us, right? And so now for a short time, right? Unfortunately, a short time, those differences between different parts of the country, disappeared, right? We were together because the whole country was attacked. And I take this somewhat of a facetious, but not really. The strength of this response is that people in other parts of the country who hate New York, right, who see New York as really not part of their world, right, were still sympathetic and coming to our aid, because even though they're New Yorkers and all the problems with New Yorkers, they're still part of us. And when they attack us, even if we don't like that part of us, we respond. And so there was that unity. It didn't last long or very long, but it was a special moment. And that's part of that strength, right? We came together, right? But the other side of that, of course, was then we were ready to strike out at those that we perceived to be against us, right? And so there was, the drumbeat of war and the invasion of Afghanistan. And we can see, that there's evidence that that's where the threat came from, and we're going to defend ourselves, right? We have a right to defend ourselves, and so we're going to go and get the evildoers, as then President Bush put it. But then we invaded Iraq, right? Well, Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. It didn't matter, right? It didn't matter because they have weapons of mass destruction. They may not have been involved in 9/11, but they could have been, and they might be involved in the worst, even a worse next 9/11. So what should we do? Just wait? No, let's go in and get them. And there was, there was a lot of protests, but there was widespread support because the idea is like they could be a threat to us. And so raining bombs down on Iraqi civilians, self-defense, right? So we can see, again, just being able to pose, and at a time when the country was rightfully frightened, terrorized, right, by those attacks, that was a time when, our need to protect ourselves and not worry about the other group was heightened. And so it was a very easy move for the Bush administration to take that terror and concern about what somebody did to us and expand it to include Iraq. I want to say that this plays a role into what Hamas did on the October 7th, right? And we read about this, and it's one of those many cases where you wonder, how can human beings do this to other human beings? How can you do this to other human beings who are, innocent human beings who are not actually threatening you, who are not there threatening you, and do these horrific things? And the answer in almost all these cases, just one aspect of it. I want to just one proviso. I'm looking at this from this evolved psychological perspective, which I think is essential, but it's only part of the picture, of course. There are political, economic, social, historical reasons that complicate any of these issues. But I'm just focusing on, for my discussion, on what's going on, what I see going on psychologically, cognitively. And so we have a situation in which, the in-group, out-group was very much at play. So Gazans have no real personal experience with Israelis, right? The only time they're interacting with actual Israelis is in the Israelis they meet as border guards, who they see only in terms of oppressors and military forces. They're not getting to experience them as human beings with families and loves and hopes. They're oppressors. And so this allows, the dehumanization of these people. And when you dehumanize people, you make it possible to treat them inhumanely. I would suggest the same thing is at play in Israel's response after, right? How do you decide, self-defense is important, but how do you decide to cut off food, water, electricity to the entire land, right? To all the hospitals, right? To, children and elderly people, civilians. How do you do that? Well, in the name of self-defense, right? And self-defense is, well, we have to protect ourselves, and so that's what's important. The group psychology comes into play, and we're not as concerned about the suffering, the humanity of those who we perceive as part of the threat. Those kind of moral niceties, of course, as humanists, we don't think these are just niceties, but we can't afford those when we're trying to defend ourselves. I think we can go through history and see this time and time again. The appeal to self-defense is one of the most effective ways to mobilize people, right? It's also the most effective way to dehumanize people. And it is the most effective way to get people to commit and to rationalize atrocities. So again, I think part of our understanding of this situation from the many sides of it is to understand how these situations are triggering or engaging different parts of our evolved moral psychology. But again, it's not just the actual threat. It's not just the actual actors who are threatening us that trigger this response, we are a symbolic species, right? Our ability to imagine and to develop imaginary, and I don't think say that in a derogatory way, groups, to extend groups based on more than just actual physical proximity is part of our nature. This is an example, right? That to the degree that we see ourselves, or you see yourself as a humanist, you see humanism as part of a way to define your group. So in the literature, we talk about this as worldviews. Sometimes it's referred to as cultural worldviews or moral worldviews, but there's a lot of interesting work being done on worldviews. So simply, or maybe just quickly, worldviews are ways that we orient ourselves to the universe, right, to the world. Worldviews give us a sense of our place in the world. It gives us, and very important, a connection to something larger than ourselves, whether that's the universe, God, or an actual community. It connects us to something that existed before we did, and then we hope will exist when we're gone. Again, worldviews give us a moral framework of what's right and wrong, what's important, what's valuable. In this sense, moral worldviews are what give meaning to our lives. It gives meaning to our actions. Our actions may not matter in this grand scheme of things, but it may matter to our group. If I'm contributing to the good of my group, that gives my actions some meanings that go beyond just my own personal circumstances. So there's, again, a lot of research into the existential significance of worldviews. And this is not just the work of the terror management theorists. There's a whole branch of existential psychology, but also there's some existential neuroscience, seeing the way the brain responds to these sort of symbolic threats. So understanding the existential significance of worldviews is one of the factors, again, from my perspective, that helps us to understand many of the conflicts we have going on in the world. I'm sure I've talked about this before, and I'm sure you've read about this, but this is what I think helps us to understand how in the world Donald Trump can continue to be so popular. And to a more specific example, and I know I've talked about this, the continuing response, overwhelming response of evangelicals, right, to Donald Trump, despite the chasm between the moral values of Donald Trump and the moral values of the professed moral values of evangelicals, right? How do evangelicals, which always focused on the moral character of their leaders, support Donald Trump and continue to support Donald Trump after seeing what he did for 4 years? So the studies of understanding how and why people support Donald Trump, specific to the evangelicals, the dominant view is they're responding to an existential threat to their group. White Christians are a dwindling number in the United States. They no longer have the same political power they used to. They are no longer the dominant religious group, right? America is no longer, they're still the largest overall group, but there's no longer a majority of white Christians, right? So the United States demographically is no longer a majority white Christian nation in terms of its religiosity. Its world, so its numbers are actually shrinking. This has changed a little bit in the last couple of years, which is interesting, but they are the oldest group. Their numbers have been shrinking, while, and I've mentioned this, the youngest group are the nuns, and you're familiar with this. These are the people who are religious, are spiritual but not religious, who have rejected institutional religion, who might identify atheists, agnostics, or humanists. Right? That group continues to grow. I think it's the total population now. In terms of the population of the U.S., it's something like 35–36%, and for people under 40, it's even higher. Demographically, evangelicals, white Christian Protestants are losing out demographically, and the cultural wars they had been losing regularly. So they perceived, that their worldview was under threat, and when you're under threat, right, you want to protect yourself. You want to defend yourself. And that's what they see in Donald Trump, somebody who's willing to fight for them. And Donald Trump appropriated that language very effectively. The other factor that research, and this actually seems to be one of the strongest predictors of support for Donald Trump, and that's racial anxiety. Right? This is a response to, again, the changing demographics that the United States is not as white as it used to be. It's not as Christian as it used to be. So that seems to also be a factor in play there. So when we ask these questions, I'm sure you ask, and I ask, how often that people, he's not actually helping any of these groups materially, but he is helping them, not intentionally, existentially, right? He seems to be somebody who's standing up for their worldview, right? And when your worldview is under attack, right, on a deep level, this doesn't have to be conscious. When your worldview is under attack, you respond to it. Your brain processes this as an existential threat. And that triggers that terror management response, where what you're looking for is someone to protect you and to protect your group. I think that's a play. Yeah, good. Timing is good. I think that's a play in many of our problems, many of the polarizing issues that we're dealing with. All right. So to bring it to an end, I learned a little bit late that the theme of the Sunday platforms this year has been the concept of heart. So let me say a little bit about heart. Talking about our amazing capacity to understand the universe on grand and minute levels. It's one of the amazing accomplishments of human beings. But the other thing, and perhaps more amazing, is our capacity for heart, for compassion, for empathy. Right? And it's sometimes hard to keep a focus on that when the way the world is working. But the fact that we can live in such large communities, largely peacefully, is a testimony to our ability to recognize, at least on some level, other people's humanities. Our ability to care deeply about what's going on to people halfway across the world is an amazing extension of our empathy, right? To care about people whose actual lives are not impacting materially on ours, but they are impacting on us in a moral sense. It's triggering our moral sensibilities. So again, our ability to extend our compassion and empathy to others is unmatched in the animal kingdom. It's really one of our noblest traits. But what we see is that when heart is warped by tribalism, right? By narrow tribalism, by these in-group biases, our heart, our compassion becomes one of our most dangerous traits, because all that compassion and willingness and care, willingness to sacrifice gets turned inward to the group and leaves everybody else outside to fend for themselves. So, in closing, right? I don't think it's possible for us to escape this in-group bias. But we are not condemned to a narrow tribalism, right? So again, it's just part of our nature, as I see it. We of course can contest it, it's an empirical claim, that we are biased toward people we recognize as sharing things that are important to us. But, and this is also supported by the science, there's no biological determination about who is us, right? Who's in our group, right? That is informed by our experiences, that's informed by our upbringing, by our culture, and it is supported by the other tool we have, and this is something we celebrate on Darwin Day, and that's our ability to think, right? Reason, right? It's not, reason in some abstract, computational way. It's our ability to think about what we're doing and to be self-critical, right? We can use our reason to guide our hearts, right? To make us aware of when is this moral righteousness that we feel, which is so important, when is that being guided by our true values rather than by something more intuitive, innate, and perhaps inconsistent with our professed values. So heart is, again, our greatest capacity, but it needs to be heart guided by reason. Thank you. Okay.
Just move over so I can talk. Okay, so now we have time for people to ask questions of our speaker. We set aside about 10 minutes. Remember, it's really a question for clarification or to ask our speaker to expound further on some things that maybe you'd like to hear more about. So I think the way we'd like to do this, since there really isn't an opportunity for those who are on Zoom to sort of hang out with John afterwards, we'll have the first people first on Zoom. If there's anyone on Zoom that has a question for our speaker. Joan, you'll let me know if there is? Okay, then David, you said, yeah. Why don't you come up, or I'll give you the microphone?
I'm sure I can hear you.
Yeah, you know, but people on Zoom.
Okay.
That, of course, was brilliant, and I loved it. But now I won't. There's a lot of just simple question though. You started off talking about the trade-off involved in the development of large man. I would like to hear you talk about what are the trade-offs that the human species has.
Okay, great. Two that have been mentioned, and this is I have this now because I was just teaching this in class the other day. So it seems to have been, so we have so much energy, so, so many there's only so many calories we can bring in a day, right? And there's a study showing that the amount of calories we would need to survive and support our brain, we'd be having to do nothing but eat for 9 to 10 hours every day, right? Not feasible. So the trade-off. So one of the trade-offs seems to have been driven by technology is cooking, right? Cooking allows us to draw, nutrition out of food without having to digest it raw. So other animals that we're the only animal that cooks. Animals that the food we eat raw, right? Then it's our intestines, our guts that are doing all that work to digest the food. And we know other animals do spend hours, 8 hours a day eating, and they have much larger guts than we do. So there's been a shrinkage of the guts because with fire, we're able to cook food and have a lot of that digestion done before it gets in. The other, and this is interesting, is because there's a curious fact that pound for pound, for example, chimpanzees are twice as strong as humans, right? And it's not that they have muscles that are twice as big. So again, the research has shown, and it's very interesting how they're doing this with gene studies, is chimpanzees have genes that direct more of the glucose, right, to muscles, right, than humans do, right? So the trade-off is, other animals are directing a lot of their energy to their muscles that they need in order to survive. And I think chimpanzees are spending a lot of time walking on their knuckles, right? Standing up help, all right? We've diverted that from our muscles to our brains, right? So we're not as powerful pound for pound as chimpanzees, but we've had that expansion of the brain that the chimpanzees have not experienced. Yeah.
Okay, Lorraine, and you want to come up so that way people on Zoom could hear the question.
So my question is, how do we get the other group to not feel that we are existentially threatening them? I mean, with a dog, an animal, if they feel threatened, you back off, but if we back off, we're in danger of being taken over, and then we're threatened. So,
Great, So that's the question, right? Because we do need to defend ourselves, and our worldviews are important. So, I mean, this may be a simple answer. One thing is not to preemptively treat people as if they are the other, right? Not to create conditions where other groups are going to see us as the other, right? So it's a preemptive act, and this is, again, very consistent with humanism. If we're treating others, even the other, all right, as human beings, right, then there's that reduces the chances that they're going to see us as others, right, and diminish our humanity. So that ethical treatment is a key part of it, right? An essential part of it, which we all know. The other that I'm very interested in working out, this is complicated, is how we talk about controversial issues, right? And this is something that, at Hofstra, we're struggling to decide how to handle this. What is our responsibility as faculty in the midst of what's going on in Israel and Gaza, in face of, this election coming up? How do we have conversations with people where different values, different perspectives can enter into dialogue rather than triggering that in-group, out-group bias, right? So part of it is trying to have conversations, not where we're going to agree and where we may disagree passionately, but finding a way to use language that is not going to be triggering, of this in-group, out-group bias, right? So by having conversations in which we are, again, without avoiding, and this is where, pushback, and I get the pushback, we don't want to in any sense suggest, moral equivalence. We don't have to, whatever side we're taking, have to think that both sides are equally right or equally wrong. We can have these discussions, but without losing sight of the humanity of others. And let me go one more moment about this, because this is where I really think, and when I teach Intro to Cognitive Science, you have to tell them all the interesting things we're going to do. I say, here's why it's important to me. The moral aspect of this is, if we're going to learn how to live together, continue to live together peaceably, we have to recognize how the language we use, the way we behave is going to be perceived, right? Not whether it's right or wrong, agree, but how it's being processed, right, by our moral psychology. What are we saying, and how are we saying it? Are we going to be saying things, again, not saying that we can't defend our positions, but are we using language or discussing in a way where we're not recognizing how the other person is going to receive this? Not in the sense of will they agree or disagree, but will this make them see me as other? Will it signal to them my lack of respect for their humanity? And here's where, again, Darwin, and I think Arthur was bringing this up, has taught us that we are all connected. The psychology is something that expresses itself in very different ways, but it's part of what it is to be human. And so what's the difference between you and your opponent? What's the difference between supporters of Trump and supporters of Biden, Hamas and Israel, right? We can also be very different in how we're going to view it. But in all these cases, these are human beings who are starting out with similar propensities for moral biases and cognitive activity, and all that's been shaped differently by their experiences. So then those experiences may lead people to do terrible things. But if we recognize that it's all coming from this, if I may say, human nature and the way it's been shaped, that beneath all the controversy and the conflict, there still is some shared humanity that we can speak to, or at least respect, right? It's the hard thing to do, but I think that's the essential thing to do. Thank you.
Linda, and then we have Ashley, and then we'll be the concluding questions. Go ahead, Linda.
Yeah.
I'm sorry? Oh, on Zoom as well? Yep.
Okay, so I'm just wondering how with the relationship, with the power that Trump seems to gained, how much cult-like behavior do you think it is? Because that's what the conclusion I've come to, that this is a cult, what's happening. But it could be totally wrong. I don't know.
I think that explains a lot of it, and not just Trump, like the extreme polarization we're seeing. So the more you're only hearing and listening to and speaking to people who think like you, the more that's reinforced. I mean, that's what's happening in a cult, right? People are being isolated from a larger community. They're living a very structured life around, and everybody's living the same way. Everybody's thinking the same way. We're engaging in the same rituals where they can't think outside of that construct. That's what's happening in our politics today, on both sides to some degree. But I think, yeah, so the cult-like support of Trump is that. They only listen to certain news. They have all the arguments against the others and the demonizing of the anti-Trump. So it is at least for some of them, a good part of them, it is a cult. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I know there's one person on Zoom. That will be the last question that we have, because there are other people in the room that have questions, and you'll have the opportunity to talk to John when we're done. Otherwise, we have to close the meeting at some point. So whoever's on Zoom, I don't know who that is. Ginger, you have a question?
I have a question. Wait, I'm muted. Am I muted?
No,
That's okay.
no. Let her know she's not muted, please, someone. Just go up to the mic.
I can hear you.
Yeah. So what I'm wondering is, listening to your speak, there is or was a man named Marshall Rosenberg. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
No.
And he created a theory called nonviolent communication, and it really deals with judging. So I'm wondering if judging is something that is specific to the human species and not to the animal species, that we are constantly judging each other, and it creates conflict. So without judging, do we lessen? Is it part of our brain? Is it built into our brain to judge each other that the animal species does not have?
Yeah, so great question. I would say I would distinguish between judging and being judgmental, and we can leave that. But in terms of judging one another, it is part of what it is to be social, right? Part of being social, and other animals do it in different ways. We're evaluating others. We're evaluating, even in terms of chimpanzees and gorillas, they're evaluating who's going to be a good ally, what leader might be weak, right? So they're making evaluations or judgments. For humans, it's very important for us to judge who can we trust, right? Who might support us, right? Who might cheat us, right? That is part of the complexities of living in a group where you have to trust, where you have to make sacrifices, but you don't want to end up being, and this is the term used in the literature, a sucker, right, who gets taken advantage of all the time. So I say, that evaluating others is part of the social, it comes out of our social nature. We share it with others. We're particularly good at it, and it's more complicated because of how complex our social groups are. But I think judging is baked in, if we want to use that language, but I think that's something different than being judgmental, where it's a more holistic critique of a person or a position. I don't know if that helps.